you.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, everyone. Oh, man, it's
Hi,
totally
Kara.
sold out. Ronan, you like great, apparently. So I'm going to read this from this script I've got here, because they tape it, and we're also going to put it on the Recode Decode podcast, so people who aren't here get to listen to it, and then we're just going to jump in. We got lots to talk about.
Kara gives great podcasts. You should all
I give great
subscribe.
podcasts, and Pulitzer Prize-winning Ronan gives great journalism. So we're going to call him tonight. We're only going to call him Pulitzer Prize-winning. Maybe, I guess I can't say P.P. Ronan, that wouldn't work. Anyway, hi everybody, welcome to tonight's program at the Commonwealth Club. I'm Kara Swisher, executive editor of Recode, and tonight it is my privilege to be in conversation with Ronan Farrow, investigative journalist and author of the new book, War on Peace, The End of Diplomacy and the Decline of American Influence, so positive, for which he interviewed every living Secretary of State and some who didn't seem like they were living, among many others. He's also the that wasn't in here. He's also the newly minted winner of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for his journalism. On Harvey Weinstein and the culture of sexual harassment in Hollywood and beyond. There's so much to discuss, so let's get started.
Let's do it.
So let's talk about first, I don't know where to start. There's so much to discuss with you. Let's start with...
We also go way back, and I still owe Kara because she really went through the hell that was appearing on my midday cable show.
Yes, that was an exciting moment.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I owe her.
I don't think I was really nice to you.
Both people who saw that program.
Yeah.
I owe them a lot.
Yeah.
You were nice. I think you were great.
I think I said you look like Joffrey on Game of Thrones. That's your problem.
Wow. I did not remember that, but now I think we have
the audience at the time, and he was killing a lot of people. He's dead now.
I think that's also probably pretty fair, the Joffrey comparison.
Well, at the time, I was saying at the time, that's what I thought the problem was. But really, it's midday program on cable, really, is the issue.
It's tough.
Nonetheless, I'm sure you have a huge television career in front of you.
I'm at HBO.
Yes, that's right.
Yep.
That's right. You're working on that show. We'll talk about that too. That's not gone up yet, though. You're working on it.
No, that deal starts in a month or two, and obviously, I was on the Today Show for the past few years.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
So we'll get to NBC and all your television stuff, but let's talk about the books. Let's start with the book, because I do want to get to Harvey Weinstein, because today I think Ashley Judd said she was suing.
She did.
And we'll talk about that. But let's talk about the book, because it wasn't, first of all, when do you find the time right now? Because you jump from topic to topic. But talk about how this book and how you got into doing this. You worked for the State Department.
Yes, I only
Explain
look like Joffrey. I actually have more work experience
Yes,
than Joffrey.
I know. Right. You're 30, although I suspect secretly you're 102. But
both probably true. I am quite old-fashioned and not very cool. I mean, you see the shoes I'm wearing.
Yeah, I do.
And I went to school really young. I was a big nerd, and I had this kind of Doogie Howser trajectory where I went to college when I was 11, and so I started working early, and that was partly journalism. I was doing UNICEF advocacy in Sudan and a number of difficult African conflict zones, and trying to tell stories that I felt weren't getting enough attention there. And actually, a lot of that aligns very closely with the reporting I ultimately did on sexual assault for The New Yorker, because I was telling the stories of survivors of rape as a weapon of war in Sudan. And a lot of that ran in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Post, the LA Times. But I was just kind of cold submitting these rinky-dink op-eds. They were small pieces of commentary. I went off to law school after that and was at this inflection point where I was considering whether to go back to, a big corporate evil-ish seeming firm. Some of you clearly have been there.
So many to choose from, but go ahead.
Yes, so I mean, it's the only kind they do there. But Richard Holbrooke, who I had interned for years before, who was this larger-than-life veteran diplomat, came along and was putting together this kind of Ocean's 11 heist team of weirdos and outsiders, which literally was the phrase that was used to describe it by a very senior military official in this book, weirdos. And, he was an incredibly persuasive guy. Very difficult, huge ego, but really behind certainly one of the great examples of modern peacemaking in Bosnia. And Henry Kissinger once said, never say no to Richard Holbrooke. You'll eventually say yes, and it'll be painful getting there.
Right.
And so I took that to heart, and
And also kind of
I went off to Afghanistan.
Right. So also a fascinating person. He was larger than I once had a lunch with him and watched him eat an entire basket of bread, but that's another thing. It was
No,
fascinating.
he was not a delicate eater.
No, it
which I
wasn't.
talk
It was
about in this
everywhere.
book.
But I wasn't going to say because it's not very nice. But he was like had a lot of things to say. So you went over there. You went over. At what age were you at this?
I was by then 20. I was, no longer a wunderkind.
Yeah. Okay.
And as Holbrooke liked to point out all the time, you're not a kid genius anymore. And we were in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Washington going back and forth. And one of the trends that I watched unravel on the ground was the shrinking space for diplomacy.
Right.
And how if you wanted anything done, whether it was getting a well dug or starting dialogue with a community on the ground in Afghanistan, you kind of had to do it through the Pentagon because that was the only place we had capacity left.
Right. So so this was happening well before what's happening now. The
Absolutely.
ideas and why? What was from your perspective, was the declining role of?
So there's several answers to that. One is that it's a vicious cycle. Every time we slash away at America's diplomats and what we invest in them,
Which has been going on for a long time.
yes, we create a situation where American diplomacy is less useful because it's been hobbled, and that takes years to regenerate, and we haven't been doing that. So, I talk about how after the Cold War, the Clinton administration came in and presided over budget cuts to the State Department that are on a similar scale to what we saw under Rex Tillerson and the Trump administration. 30% cuts over the course of the 90s. And you talk to Madeleine Albright, as you said, every living former Secretary of State is on the record in this book. Albright will say, well, that was Jesse Helms' fault. This
Right.
was the fault of a Republican Congress. And then you talk to Republicans who were in congressional leadership at the time, and they say, well, no, it was the Clinton White House. And the truth is, both are true. Both are to blame for how we treated the State Department during that era. But if you look at how Warren Christopher, Clinton's first Secretary of State, sounded going onto the Hill and saying, here's why we should slash our State Department to ribbons, he sounded a hell of a lot like Rex Tillerson in a more recent era.
Right.
The commonality is that administration after administration sees this low-hanging fruit of diplomacy and development is just 1% of our budget.
Right.
But it's easy to talk about dusty
cuts.
bureaucrats not getting anything
Foggy
done.
bottom.
Yeah. So if you want to not take the political risk of saying, hey, maybe we need to rein in the Pentagon, if you are already in the thrall of...
And we can use the Pentagon as effective, presumably, or it's effective in whatever we want.
It's effective, but I think what I chronicle in this book is just how many long-term costs there are that we don't see up front if all we're empowered to do is think tactically.
So what mentally happened? Because if it hadn't started, because Tillerson sort of synopsized that idea of cutting the State Department, and the backlash was massive for him, and we'll get to him in a second. But what did it start as? What was the impetus for this happening?
Well, if you go back to that example during the Clinton administration, the impetus was, as James Carville put it, it's the economy, stupid.
Right.
We're refocusing on the domestic. We're not going to spend on these international boondoggles anymore. And those kinds of arguments rest on, I think, a really dangerous set of misunderstandings about our diplomats, who are fundamentally brave men and women who get crappy pay and drag their families around the world to difficult places, often dangerous places, and give up opportunities to have a cushier life in the private sector to serve this country and to make us safer, to screen dangerous people from coming in. They're the first line of defense, to broker the deals that can keep our brave servicemen and women out of the line of fire. This is really important work, but because of the optics of peacemaking being less easy to understand than making things go boom, very often on the campaign trail, these are the guys that get the shaft.
That get shaft. But it's interesting because we have a conception of ourselves as the Secretary of State being the most important, one of the more important roles, and we have this historical number of secretaries of state who have been so prominent over the course of the entire U.S. history.
She says this because she watches Madam Secretary.
I do.
CBS.
And I right now wish Tia Leone was indeed Secretary of State. But
I
that's
think
another
Tia
issue.
Leone would make a great Secretary of
She
State.
looks
She would
good,
look fierce.
she's
Yep.
sensible. She always solves everything by the end of the program. She just solved a crisis in the Suzanne yesterday, last night.
Congrats, Tia.
It was great. And then she made dinner for her handsome husband. And they were adorable.
It's a very accurate show.
Yeah. So, but the conceptual idea is this Henry Kissinger. This is an exciting. I just heard a very interesting anecdote. I hate to drop a name, but I was at a dinner with Tony Blair, and he told an anecdote. It's like such. I just dropped so many names. I just can't, he told
For
it. I
people
have
listening
to,
on the podcast, I just gave the audience a look like.
Okay, all right. But I'm just saying, he said it. I don't want to take responsibility. I didn't say this. He gets credit for it. But apparently, someone went up to Henry Kissinger and said, "I hear you're fascinating. Fascinate me." So you have to fascinate me. Which
That person sounds terrible.
I know
but
it
go
does,
on.
but I kind of like it. But we have that idea of this swaggering Secretary of State
Yeah.
and stuff like that. But it's a canard then, from your perspective, that we don't give it the kind of respect it deserves because we want to do might over.
Well, we're talking about two different things here. I mean, there are the career Foreign Service officers, from whom you often have ambassadors and high-level leadership positions filled, but who are separate from the political appointees who come in,
Right.
which is mostly what we're talking about when we say a Secretary of State.
Right.
I think that the denigration of those career officers is a real problem and is one of the things underpinning this repeated slashing away at the State
Did you
Department.
ever want to join, become a diplomat? I was in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown.
Really?
Yeah.
So
I wanted to be a spy, though, so that's different.
you'd be good at both, to be honest.
I might be one right now, and it's the best cover ever.
Well, I may also be one, Tara. But technically, they are not supposed to have
Right.
journalist cover stories.
Supposedly, allegedly.
Supposedly, allegedly.
We would be like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but without all the sex. But go ahead. So,
Kara, first of all, the night is young.
okay, all right, okay. It's not happening, Ronan.
I just, she's always rebuffing me.
I am, constantly, and
So,
for good reason.
I'm interested actually in your answer to this question because even when you were in school looking at this
Yeah.
decision, I think that the prestige of the profession was
High.
already
No.
it was better than it is now, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
But you clearly decided not to go that route. Why?
Because I was gay, and there was the process was terrible
Good
at the
answer.
time. At the time,
Yeah.
I'm super old, but it was really bad
Yeah.
at the time. And I remember the interview was terrible. It was all about being out, and I'm like, I am out, but if you were out, if you went to Saudi Arabia, it was ridiculous. It was an insane thing. I would have
Well,
done it.
I'm glad you raised that actually because right now, obviously, one of the points of contention during Pompeo's confirmation process was his views on this issue, and in the soup of fears evoked by his hawkishness and his willingness to stand lockstep with the president on the rolling back of major diplomatic accomplishments. There is also, I think, for many Foreign Service officers, including openly gay ones who talk in this book, a lot of fear about this
Reprisals, yeah.
particular strain of conservatism coming into
Right,
a
back again.
now very liberal department.
Yeah, absolutely. Greatest hits. Talk about this idea of if you have all these different things around the world that are challenges right now. Let's lead up to it. One of the things you were talking about was the last sort of very prominent Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. How do you assess her? Because Trump attacks it a lot of the time, a lot of the deals they made during the time. How do you assess that tenure?
So here's the
Because people thought she
interesting.
did a great job, for example, during that time.
And I
Look back.
reported to her for several years while she was in that job. Here's the interesting and complicated thing about the story of the Obama administration when it comes to diplomacy. So people think of Obama standing there in Cairo and talking about peace and the importance of not just relying on military solutions, which he used that kind of language a lot. But in fact, there are a lot more pros and cons when you look at Obama's diplomatic legacy. In this book, War on Peace, you have people like Ben Rhodes speaking very frankly about the fact that for much of the first term, for many of the major policy reviews, they were somewhat snowed by a culture of celebrity generals, which is a phrase that Ben uses when he talks about this. And Richard Holbrooke's story ends with him fighting for peace negotiations in Afghanistan, for some kind of a political settlement, and being rebuffed partly because there really wasn't any room for points of views that weren't lockstep with the military's
Military,
view.
right.
And so that's the kind of the con, that when I was there for the first term, and that's when Hillary Clinton was there, obviously, there was a very, very hawkish, militarized climate in a number of different policy processes. There was a consolidation of power at the White House to the exclusion of the empowerment of diplomats, and I talk about how that echoed around the world. And people like Samantha Power are, again, frank about saying kind of mea culpa on that. But I will say, in the second term of the Obama administration, which I was not present for and Secretary Clinton was not present for, an interesting thing happened, which is, by the admission of a lot of these officials, they course corrected. And they spent a few years really investing in large-scale diplomatic endeavors. And by the end of that second term, in just a few short years, you had the Iran deal, as controversial as it is, certainly a serious diplomatic undertaking. You had the thaw in relations with Cuba. You had the Paris Climate Change Accord, all in rapid succession. So I think the Obama administration gives us both lessons: how dangerous the militarization of foreign policy is, and also how quickly you can pull out of the nosedive if you choose to.
Right. So let's talk about today, because a lot of people feel, your piece and then the section in this book about Rex Tillerson was the decimation may now be so damaging that it's not recoverable, although I suspect it probably is recoverable. But the concept of this particular Secretary of State and what happened here in a very short period of time. So we'll talk about that, and then I want to go through a couple areas and switch over to...
So to be clear, I'm not drawing an equivalence between what happened under Obama or George W. Bush and what's happening
more
now.
a militarization of diplomacy.
Well, I think it's a difference of degrees. What is happening now is an unprecedented new extreme. There are lessons to be drawn from history where we have tried this before. We've seen a little bit of this movie before, but this is a much bigger production of it. We are laying waste to the State Department. Within days of the Trump administration assuming power, there were these just mass purges of our career officials. And yes, to an extent, political appointees come and go, and they leave when new people come in, but this is different. These were, people who had been there for decades, with expertise in some of the most important challenges we face in the world, just unceremoniously being given the boot. Positions that have not been completely wiped out, as in they no longer exist, are left unfilled. There are embassies without ambassadors everywhere. There are regional offices across the State Department without assistant secretaries of state. Everyone is an acting official. It's chaos.
And is this by plan or by not plan?
I think that it is by plan without a care in the world for the consequences. This is a White House that it appears simply does not want to deal with or engage with our diplomats or the idea of diplomacy.
Or use them.
I mean, Rex Tillerson was a great crystallization of just how bad it can get in terms of a Secretary of State who firewalled himself from all of the experts in the building, who presided over these incredibly deep budget cuts, who really was seen as the willing executioner of the State Department. And he's more candid on the record in this book, in one of his last interviews, than I've ever seen him
Well,
be.
he could give a fuck at that point, right?
I think that he was
It's
starting...
like I ran Exxon and now this
He was
clown is
right.
firing
He just
me by
ruined his
Twitter.
legacy. So,
Right.
so perhaps he was approaching the point of giving zero fucks.
Yeah.
He says, that he was too inexperienced to know really how to do budget advocacy on the Hill. He says that he fought the White House tooth and nail and lost those fights to fill a lot of these empty positions. There's a lot of passing the buck, but like so many of these giant characters in War and Peace, he is complicated. He's not all good or all bad. He had a tremendous legacy of private sector leadership. That doesn't happen by accident. Clearly, he's a smart guy with a good degree of skill in this, who just wound up deeply at sea.
I did like your part where the whole staff is arguing with each other in front of you, which was like fantastic.
Yeah, it was really acrimonious
Among
by
and
the
between
end.
them.
A lot of infighting. It was like, Red
weren't
Wedding
even
was about
hiding
to
it.
happen.
Yeah, they just weren't even hiding there. Like it's like an Italian family going to town or something like that. My family, like arguing in front of guests, which was interesting. So what does that leave with, since given there's so much going on, like Africa, for example, the Chinese making inroads in Africa, or the Iran deal, or the Paris Accord. They're just
So
not.
there's a lot of questions in one. So, let me
like
do this
20
in
of them.
reverse.
Yeah.
I think because that's the
Because we're going to end
broadest
on North
question.
Korea, but go ahead.
Great. And North Korea's addressed. Love ending on North Korea. Look, we may all end with or as a consequence of North Korea, if we're not careful. So when you ask about sort of these diplomatic accomplishments like
Yeah.
the Paris Accord, they are an endangered species right now. And the Trump administration has very deliberately set about trying to dismantle all of these accomplishments. And it seems pretty clear from the rhetoric that's used that this is less it's less a substantive concern and more about just wanting to tear down Obama administration accomplishments. Which is incredibly short-sighted, obviously. These are deals that brought us closer to our allies internationally, where we've made major commitments that if we go back on them, it will raise serious questions about the United States as an actor of good faith in the international arena. And you know, in each of these cases, I think the rollback has already proved to be destructive for our standing in the conflict in question. You asked about Africa. So a couple of things. One is there's a chunk of this book where I look at, okay, the trend you've just heard about, but how does that echo around the world? And Africa is one of the examples. I was in the Horn of Africa at a time when we were propping up the Ethiopians as they invaded Somalia. And I give this whole complicated story where we're backing different factions as they fight each other on the ground. And the interesting and instructive thing about this is we did that because we kicked the diplomats out. We did that because opportunities for regional peace agreements and peacekeeping forces presented themselves, and we thought it would interfere with what the Pentagon and the CIA were doing, which was backing these regional warlords. And so we actively sabotaged chances at diplomacy. And you know, I tell that story in several different parts of the world, but that's one of them. So that's part of the Africa question. And then you mentioned China. China is the shadow that looms over this whole narrative, because whether it's in Africa or Afghanistan and Pakistan or
Technology.
pick a place, right? Technology. All of these places where China now has massive infrastructure projects. We see a stark difference in the trend line. I mean, I'm careful not to overstate the case here. The United States still has the upper hand in a whole lot of ways. It will take time for China to truly erode our foothold. However, it is striking to notice that in so many places where China was, until recently, a kind of rapacious interloper that didn't care about human rights and was just commercially minded, now they've got regional envoys doing shuttle diplomacy in places like Sudan, trying to get big splashy political settlements, exactly in the arena where we've stepped back, and I think partly because we've stepped back. They are doubling down on their spending on their embassies and their development projects, and I personally have talked to young people around the world who grow up with these spectacular examples of Chinese investment in their country.
Versus U.S. investment, which had been for...
Which has now come to embassies without ambassadors in many of these places.
Right. So talk about our relations, right? We just had Macron here. Angela Merkel came and ran as fast as she could back to Germany, it looked like.
After a few sassy looks.
Yes, it doesn't work. It didn't work for her. But Macron did, whatever he was doing with Trump. It was, it's like Cajafol 3.
Dug a grave, I think.
I don't know. I'm not sure what was happening. I have to say it was the happiest Trump has looked in a long time.
He loves
not that there's anything wrong
putting
with that.
people down. No, we love for the president to be happy.
Yeah,
but he loves the move of like, oh, there's a fake speck of dandruff, let me take it off. You all caught that moment.
Right. Yeah, I saw that.
I guess that's a kind of diplomacy.
Yeah. So how are we looked at around the world, and especially with the Russians so aggressively intruding themselves in our national affairs?
So The question of what this has done, this
Right.
war on peace has done to our relationship with our allies is a really important one. And the answer is, you'll be not at all shocked to hear, very troubling. Angela Merkel is one of the many international leaders who has sort of repeatedly had to say, frankly, extraordinary and unprecedented things about the United States
Right.
because we are no longer viewed as a trustworthy actor.
Right.
This happens in all sorts of situations. She's been very frank in her alarm about our posture towards North Korea, for instance. Certainly that's true of Macron, too. You see him in this most recent trip saying, yeah, sure, maybe another Iran deal, basically as a Hail Mary pass to try to not have this administration blow up an agreement that will, A, if we pull out unilaterally and sabotage the thing, drive a wedge between the United States and all of its European allies, B, send a devastating message to the North Koreans at a time where we desperately need them to believe that if we strike a deal, we will stick to it.
Right.
And C, potentially reinstate a rising nuclear threat that we had at least temporarily contained for the sake of the whole world.
Period of time, for the
Yeah,
period of time we did.
yeah.
So, North Korea, they're meeting this week. It was like another bunch of photo ops. I'm
So
expecting him to appear on the cover of Vanity Fair at any moment. So, you know what I mean? Like it could go either way. What do you?
it could go either way, and I think that's the point. Obviously, we all hope sincerely that this moonshot of Kim Jong-un meeting with President Trump will be productive.
Right.
However, time will tell whether that's actually the case. And I tell the story
Because
of
they have come this close before.
we've seen this movie before, and we've heard these exact promises before, and they have turned out to be lies. We have gotten played before. I tell the story in this book of the decades of diplomacy around North Korea and the reasons why it failed, and also the reasons why it didn't completely fail. And we might have been better served not to walk away from that diplomatic progress, and why the situation we're in now is partly a consequence of the periods in which we did
Yeah.
walk away,
Yeah.
like during the Obama
How
administration.
do you assess Trump's strategy here? I mean, it's basically, I'm going to be crazier than that guy and then see what he does. It seems like, I mean, he said it. It's like, I
And,
was
there's
real mean.
actually nothing wrong with that as part of a toolkit of diplomatic options.
Right.
I think if you have a controlled craziness
Right.
and you can deploy that at will, that could be really powerful.
Yeah.
But it's got to be embedded in a set of expertise and individuals who know the pressure points and the history and the ways in which they lie again and again,
Right.
and the concessions that you should take and the ones that you should not.
The crazy part seems to be working, but the second part, I know a lot of the people on those desks are gone. Like
Gone. And you can really just directly contrast what the staff around this looks like now versus what it looked like during the Bush administration, where under Condoleezza Rice there were these six-party talks, and I tell the story of the diplomat who led those. This really tireless endeavor where, although it fell through in the end, we got them to shut down one of their reactors for the first time in years. We made huge inroads in our relationship with China around this, and any long-term solution to contain North Korea is going to involve China.
Right, absolutely.
They're the only players
Yep.
who have leverage there. We made progress, and then we walked away from it. And right now, we are not going back to leverage those gains. We are throwing it all out of the window. He's doing diplomacy by tweet. There's going to be this one-on-one meeting. As you say, the experts who once steered this process, during that Bush era, there was a huge unit of North Korea experts who really knew the region. That's no longer the case. And
Well, he's saying they didn't get it work anyway, so what's the difference if I do it this way?
yeah, exactly. And I think that is an ahistorical view. And I think if you look at what those experts and diplomats accomplished, it is not inconsiderable. And the people who know where we screwed up before and who know how we affected the modest gains before are the guys you want to be listening to right now.
Right.
Where we desperately need those views to embed this moonshot of a leader-to-leader
So who does
meeting
this
in a
depend
long-term
on?
strategy.
Just Pompeo and who?
It is very difficult to see how this administration can turn this around, given realistically what the president seems to think of diplomacy, and how little he seems to care about empowering America's diplomats. Mike Pompeo is a more experienced government operator than Rex Tillerson was. As much as people are fearful about what he might bring to the table, the career officers that I'm talking to who were brave enough to, turn whistleblower for this book, are hopeful as well. They hope that he'll be able to stand up to the president more, and that when the president says, actually, this guy is much more on my wavelength than Rex Tillerson, actually, that's maybe Pompeo knowing how to play the president better. There's a White House official who describes Mattis's approach to the president in this book and says, I believe the quote is sort of doing Mattis's voice, whatever that sounds like. Yes, Mr. President, you're so perfect, Mr. President. You won so much, Mr. President. But here's an alternative view, Mr. President. And that White House source gave that anecdote in the context of saying Rex Tillerson never got the hang of that.
Right.
So maybe, just maybe, Mike
Obsequious
Pompeo.
ass kissing to get what you want.
Sure, and maybe Mike Pompeo knows how to play that game better, and will therefore be able to actually advocate for the State
What would
Department.
be a
It
win
needs
in
leadership.
North Korea? And then I want to move on to your.
What would be a win?
Yeah.
I think that any concession in terms of their nuclear ambitions is at this point a win. And any actual verifiable, inspectable gains in terms of dismantling their nuclear capacity is a win. But again, much more so than Iran, this is a regime that has cheated in the past when we've struck these deals and given incomplete or inaccurate data. I even described an incident where they turned over that incomplete data on pages that were tainted with enriched uranium.
Yeah.
Like the pages that were supposed to say that they didn't have the enriched uranium.
Oh, they're funny, those.
They got a sense of humor.
Yeah.
So, all of which is to say, you need experts keeping an eye.
Humor. It's an enriched sense
Ba-doom.
if it is.
Yeah, you need experts keeping
Plus
an eye
they
on this.
preside over a vicious series of internment camps and all over.
Of course. Well, so I'm glad you raised that, because one of the things that falls by the wayside, I think, as a consequence of this trend of the militarization of American foreign policy is human rights. It's one of the first things that goes out of the window when you're dealing with warlords in a really expedient way and strongmen in a really expedient way, and all of the relations are general to general and spy to spy. That said, I think one of the misunderstandings about diplomacy that gets exploited and weaponized against the State Department is this idea that these deals can be perfect, that diplomacy can look complete. Realistically, what happens is what you got in Bosnia, which was a difficult and imperfect agreement that gave too much power to the aggressors and maintained a lot of the factionalism and ethnic strife. Lots of reasons to critique that deal. But also it stopped years of bloodshed. And likewise, the Iran deal faces these, not incorrect criticisms based around the fact that it's not complete. It doesn't address Iran's human rights track record and its kidnappings and its non-nuclear ballistic missile tests, but it wasn't designed to. It was designed to just contain, in a limited way, this one narrow band of behavior around nuclear progression, and it did that effectively. And there was no perfect deal that could have been an alternative. This was the best that we had because we got to it too late and too many centrifuges were already going.
Right.
And likewise, I think any deal with North Korea, if we really want to invest in a diplomatic solution, is going to look imperfect. And there are going to be the human rights problems, and we are going to have to get to them later.
Right.
And correctly, that's going to make people angry.
Right, absolutely. And your assessment of the leader of North Korea?
They make for quite a pair, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I don't think he's quite as crazy, and although appalling as ever. Speaking of appalling, Harvey Weinstein. So, congratulations on your Pulitzer.
Thank you.
Well deserved.
Thank you to all of you for caring about this issue. Thank you to all of the sources. These women did an incredibly brave thing. They went through hell to do it.
This has been a story a lot of people, I know David Carr very well before he died, but he talked to me about this story quite a bit. I've heard so many people talking about this story over the years and Harvey Weinstein's behavior.
You probably saw in one of those stories that I wrote, I uncovered the way in which David Carr was being intimidated and surveilled, and the way in which Harvey Weinstein really felt he had effectively intimidated him.
I'm not sure, he just couldn't get people to talk. One of his issues, he just couldn't get. And having been, dealing with a lot of stuff here in Silicon Valley, the same thing, getting people to talk was really the key to a lot of it. And we've written a lot of issues of this issue. We covered the POW trial. We wrote a lot about Uber's problems. But the actual unlocking people's abilities. So let's talk about that. How did you manage to do that? And one of the things I want to make the observation, I've made it publicly before, is that it's also being able to see things in a different way from the victim's mentality and to be more empathetic. And I know that it's sort of a broader term, but I don't think it was a coincidence that these stories were broken by women and a gay man. Like you have an ability to see an empathetic thing and allow people to understand people's problems. And maybe you don't agree with me.
I think
my argument for diversity.
It's a fascinating point. I mean, I think that anyone who has felt othered or unseen or unheard probably has an elevated understanding of what survivors of sexual assault go through and the extent to which they frequently feel invisible in our culture.
Right.
And that flowed from a number of part of my identity, including my sister being a survivor of sexual assault.
Right.
I had people who were very dear to me confront this issue head on and had learned just how high the stakes are and how devastating the fallout is.
Right. And a lot of reporters say don't do something that's that close to you, but I think that's exactly the people to do that.
Well, I think that every reporter I respect draws a distinction. You don't do something that's close to you in the sense that you have a personal relationship with the people directly
Right,
involved.
of course.
And I didn't. I have a perfectly lovely, superficial cocktail party relationship with Harvey Weinstein, and no business relations.
Not today, though, right? No.
No, that is past tense.
Right. Okay.
I don't
would
think
be
he's at a
awkward.
lot of cocktail parties now.
No.
Although maybe in Arizona, whatever
Yeah.
sex rehab he's at. I had no adverse feelings about him, but I did care passionately about the issue and
Right.
feel close to it in the sense that I
think
had
it's
some
important.
understanding of it.
Right,
And I think every reporter that I respect, agrees that kind of drive
It creates a better
is
outcome.
only a good thing.
Right.
We all you report on tech and you're close to that world, and it makes you a better reporter in that
Right.
world. And any matter that you feel a close affinity to and care about, I think you use that in whatever your profession is.
So how did you get these women to talk to you? Because I think that was the key part. That to me was astonishing. And the New York Times did also. But the interviews you did were particularly gripping. And they really were. They ripped your heart out, the stories of Annabella Sciorra, all the others. How did you go about that? Because you had done it there's a lot of controversy about NBC not backing you, essentially. Are those reports correct that you were working on it? They didn't feel they say they didn't feel you had it. I've heard that from them, and I said I don't believe you in any way. So I don't believe what they said there. You felt like that you didn't have support there, so you moved it over to the New Yorker.
I would say yes. It is publicly known, and everyone involved has admitted that the bulk of the year of reporting on this story happened at NBC and was intended to be for my Today Show investigative series, where I was already doing these kinds of sort of truth to power, large-scale investigations. Deaths being covered up at a government nuclear plant, or miscarriages of justice in campus sexual assault. And the Title IX issues around that, contentious issues that sometimes touched on this very matter. So yes, it was intended to be for that.
So, and did you have trouble getting them on camera to talk, or was there issues around that?
No, the very first interview was an on-the-record, on-camera interview, with a prominent person accusing Harvey Weinstein of rape. So from the very beginning, this was clearly a high-stakes story.
Right.
And very rapidly, the body of evidence expanded to an extraordinary extent. That interview would have been January of last year. By April of last year, I had played for my entire, editorial and corporate chain of command this extraordinary audio of Harvey Weinstein admitting to a sexual assault, which was made during the course of a police sting operation and had been buried for various reasons, some but not all of which have been made public. And I uncovered that, and there was a growing group of women saying, this is a safety issue, that this is a pattern, and I wish I had been warned, and maybe you can help warn the next woman.
Right.
So it became impossible for me to stop at that point.
And so what caused you to move it? Like, they just wouldn't.
I think that, I get this question all the time, obviously, and people are correct to ask. The fact that there was a veil of silence around the Harvey Weinstein story for decades is not accidental, and there were a variety of
Pressures.
systems
Right.
that kept it
Which you wrote
silent.
about, which you also wrote about.
Many of which I wrote about. And, the question of the complicity of the media and the role the media played in keeping this quiet for as long as it was quiet are important ones. And I think there will be more to say about that as time goes on and various investigations into this unfold. I just want to make sure that I tell the story that I witnessed and reveal the evidence that I have in a careful way, and that it's also timed in a way that doesn't take away from the spotlight that is correctly placed on the women and their allegations.
Right, at the time you were doing them. So
Correct. So I've wanted to, no reporter wants to become the story.
Right.
And when there is, a considerable story behind the story, you want to make sure that that doesn't come out at a time where it would eclipse the very hard-fought stories of these accusers.
Right. We'll get to the idea of him trying to shut you down in a second. But when you started putting this together, finally, for David, who's an astonishing editor.
Astonishing.
at
David
just
Remnick
astonishing.
is one of the best forces we have
the
in
editor of The New
journalism.
Yorker.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's a real hero.
Yeah.
He really champions the tough stories and is immensely principled.
Right, absolutely. Why did you go there? What was what you thought that was a place you could get the entire thing
Ken
out?
Oletta, who is a wonderful New Yorker
Media writer.
yes, had attempted to break this story for the
Many
New
times.
Yorker
He did. He just talked about it with
several times, as early as the early aughts, 2001, 2002. And I became aware that he had dug into this and had a number of accusers who had spoken to him and was struggling to get people on the record. And one of the most moving things about this story, in addition to the tremendous sacrifice and bravery of the women, was also just how generous fellow reporters were.
Yeah, he told me
to an
this, yeah.
extent, David Carr from the grave, essentially, because his widow was wonderful in helping me put together the puzzle pieces of his story, and his coworkers were generous in the same way. Ken Oletta literally gave his notes from
That's
that
what he
time
told
to
me,
me.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I went into a dusty archive in the New York Public Library and sifted through all of these meticulous reporters' notebooks and, found these contemporaneous accounts of conversations that backed up the things that I had been chasing and the sources that I had been talking to. So that was immensely helpful at a time where I was very much being gaslit and told this wasn't a story and was running into all sorts of obstacles in my career and in my life. That were being arrayed around me because I wasn't stopping. It was a lifeline to have fellow reporters say, no, there's something here, keep
Right.
going. And Ken was one of those people.
What do you think the breakthrough moment of that was for you? What was the second where you're like, aha, now I have him?
I think anytime you hear a literal recording of
Yeah,
someone
I
of
thought
that
that was-
stature admitting to it, it's
Right,
you
yeah.
know, pretty cut and dry, although obviously that didn't stop many people from trying to squash it even
Yes, they
after
did.
that point.
And also squash her, like try to ruin her.
Yes. There were whole systems arrayed against not only me and reporters working on this, but also, of course, against the women, including Ambra Badalana Gutierrez, who was the woman in that tape, who is an incredibly savvy and strong person, and did a really brave thing that she didn't have to do. With no prospect of gain. The argument that was constantly weaponized against her was that she was some kind of a hustler and she was in it to turn a buck. And
Right.
all I can say is she did not have to go back to Harvey Weinstein wearing a wire, terrified.
Right.
And there was no deal for her at the other end of that. There was nothing she got out of that except maybe preventing another woman from getting in the same situation.
Right.
And she did a number of really brave things in the course of this reporting and was smeared terribly throughout.
And the other women, when they started to speak on their record, why now do you think they did decide to do it? Because again, I remember with David and Ken, they wouldn't do it. What do you think changed?
I think that the world changed, Kara. There was a progression of brave women and also now, of course, eventually men. And I don't want to discount the importance of male survivors of sexual violence and how much we need to hear their voices. But at the time, it was mostly women coming forward and chipping away at the culture of silence. And that was true of Cosby's accusers, who spoke out at a time where it's easy for us to forget now, as this court verdict against him is hailed as a victory for human rights. When they first spoke out, and I was having these fights in newsrooms wanting to cover that, they were terribly smeared. It was a 50-50 split between serious coverage of their stories and op-eds saying, but wait, look at his cultural contribution. Look at what he did for race, look at what he did for comedy. A lot of men, it really was a gendered reaction, writing these spirited defenses of him and assisting in the takedowns of these women. And, I remember and have written about fights that I had where, for instance, I would have on my cable news program Cosby's official biographer, Mark Whitaker, who didn't mention the allegations in the biography. And I just knew about them through the grapevine and had read about, the various aborted legal processes and wanted to ask a question. Why didn't you include that? Is it ethical for you to exclude that?
Right.
And I got terrible pushback, and not all of it from a conscious place of evil or even cowardice. Just people saying, well, that's not the way we do this in polite company. Why would you ask about that?
Right.
That's not in the headlines.
Right. It is interesting because that happens all the time. I remember Gabriel Sherman, who did a great job on Ailes later. I remember sitting with him. I go, why was this none of this was in your book? And he had, he's like, the women wouldn't talk. I couldn't get them. I tried. I said, did you try real hard? Did you try real hard? I go, not hard enough. We had a really great discussion about it, and at least he was willing to talk about it. And similarly, I had a Commonwealth Club with Adam Lashinsky, and he wrote an entire book about Uber without discussing the sexism and the sexual harassment and everything else there. And I was like, how was that?
I hope there's a lesson for every journalist tackling a story where there's a little voice saying, hey, there's this other thing, and it's maybe impolite to raise it.
Right.
But it might look really bad if you don't, in retrospect.
Right.
And I do hope that that's a cautionary tale for people. And I think in this case, it was the women who, penetrated that veil of silence, against all odds and broke through with the odd story here. And, that's the Cosby accusers. It's my sister. It's Gretchen Carlson talking about the situation at Fox. Those were precedents that I was able to point to when I had these conversations with women over months and months and months as they turned over, okay, if I relive the worst trauma of a lifetime and put my trust in you as a reporter and take this risk that I will be wiped out career-wise and maybe threatened in terms of my physical safety, what happens at the end? Am I ever heard? And citing those precedents, I was able to give them a glimmer of hope. Not a great glimmer, but something, some shred of hope that they would be heard eventually.
What was your convincing argument to them?
Well, so it was telling them that the world had changed and that speaking out about this after those other precedents was going to be different, that we were in the midst of a sea change. I couldn't have anticipated how much that was true.
Right, yeah.
But I sensed that was happening, and I was able to point to the beginnings of it. And then, it was about altruism. Every single woman who went on the record about Harvey Weinstein did it because they wanted to help the next woman.
Right.
And they wanted to help the culture. And they did it, I guarantee you, looking at much more downside than upside.
Right.
And it was still important enough to them that they help. And not everyone made that decision. There were women that I was talking to for months and months who ultimately decided they weren't going to help.
It looks like there were some that were, and then later shifted.
Every variation of that.
Yeah.
There were women who never decided to go on the record. There were women who, did a gradual progression of going on background as an anonymous source and then going fully on the record. There were women who were out and then in and then back out and then back in. And that, too, is part of reporting on these stories. Right. This is a reporting process that forces people to relive the worst trauma they ever knew. It's going to be a rough ride, and I'm still dealing with sources going through hell,
Right.
trying to tell stories that haven't yet broken.
I want to get to the questions from people in a second, but talk about people, what the repercussions now are. What do you imagine? Where are we now? Or are we in this post-Me Too era, or still in the? You don't have to place us, but what do you imagine is happening now? Because you've seen this come out in orchestras, in art, in architecture, in tech, in everywhere pretty much. It's a lot in media, a whole lot in media, and Hollywood.
I think one reason why I structured those stories, and the incredible team at the New Yorker structured those stories with me around systems rather than individuals, is because the systems still have a long way to go.
Right.
And this, in my mind, was never a story about Harvey Weinstein or a story about the entertainment industry. This was a story about the abuse of power and the way in which the most powerful people in this country can manipulate the press, manipulate the judicial and legal process. In Harvey Weinstein's case, directly influence a DA's office in a really breathtaking way. Smear people, intimidate people. I mean, for crying out loud, hire combat-ready former Mossad agents to assume false identities, and follow
think
people.
They're crazy, right? It makes someone think they're gaslight people.
Yeah, and insinuate themselves into people's lives and go after women and go after reporters. I mean, these are systems that are still being used every day. I mean, I am.
You've written about AMI, the president's David Pecker, and those still in place with McDougal and Stormy Daniels.
Yes. So that's a great example of the through line here, where these are common systems employed by multiple powerful people seeking to silence opposition. What Kara's referring to is I've broken a number of stories in the last few months about secret election season payments to cover up stories on behalf of the president. And those were undertaken through an intermediary that Harvey Weinstein also used, American Media Inc., the parent company of the National Enquirer. And, I talk about how that company and a number of others were used by, this echelon of wealthy and influential person to smear people that they wanted to take off the map and to
pay off votes.
And to undertake secret payments to keep stories out of the media. And in the case of Trump, out of the political narrative in the crucial window before Americans went to the polls.
Right. And where does this end now? I mean, obviously there's a state, Michael Cohen's they're investigating that. It's going to slow roll, presumably, for a little bit.
Well, we know that the Southern District of New York, when they undertook the search warrants of various premises owned by Michael Cohen, one of the express aims, the Times has reported, was to go after communications between Michael Cohen and AMI and the National Enquirer. There are a number of other proceedings ongoing that are looking at these systems with respect to both the president and with respect to Harvey Weinstein. I think there will be a lot more unfolding in terms of the justice system and how it confronts these issues finally after so many years of them being in the shadows. And until we see the results of that, I'm reluctant to say that we have put any of this behind us.
Right, until they get either dismantled or exposed.
Yeah, you look at every pillar of complicity that I reported on over the fall, and a lot of those are still thriving, whether it's corruption in the justice system or complicity in the media. And I think there's going to be a lot more to say about all of those things.
And what happens to Harvey Weinstein?
I get asked this question a lot, and forgive me if this is kind of an annoying answer because it's a dodge, but it's a sincere dodge and with a good intention, which is, yes, there are ongoing proceedings, and I'm, in contact with brave law enforcement officers who, are very committed to not dropping the ball in the way the ball has been dropped in the past with respect to Harvey Weinstein. But I would just caution everyone that I think it's a misstep to become fixated on the taking down of men and the specific men who were behind some of these crimes. This, for me, and I know that this is the sentiment of a lot of the survivors I talk to, was always about the survivors. This was about taking stories that hadn't been heard for so long and putting a spotlight on them and making sure these brave women felt heard and seen. And I think the moment we start turning back to the spotlight being on Harvey Weinstein or any of
Right.
these alleged predators, it detracts a little bit from the focus being
the
on
stories.
Yeah, on the women and
Do
the
you
allegations.
imagine there's a fatigue now to this? I don't think there is, but I think anger is a good thing.
It's not really for me to say. You mean on the part of the culture?
Culture, yeah.
I hope that there is no fatigue for justice or accountability. I hope not.
All right, let's answer some questions. That's a great question. What would you ask Harvey Weinstein if you were interviewing him?
I've said this before. I would do a really fair interview with Harvey Weinstein. You know, we had obviously a lot of contact with Weinstein and his team around the publishing of these stories.
Right.
You know, while I am sure he is not thrilled with the ramifications of the stories, I think that he would be hard-pressed to find a moment at which we were in any way unfair to him. We gave him a very, very generous opportunity to comment again and again and again, and integrated, you know, his viewpoint in whatever way he felt was important and appropriate. And I would, you know, doing an interview with him today, adopt exactly the same posture. I would be very fair and meticulous, and if he felt that there was something important to say, I would interrogate those claims really carefully,
Right.
but also, you know, give them a fair airing.
Well, that's really nice. I'd pop him in the nose. I met him once at a Google event, and he spit food at me, and I'll never.
This is why we're a
That
good
was the
team,
worst.
Kara. You're the
live-
brawn.
No,
She's the muscle.
I'd be like, I'm gonna get you. You're gonna later. I'm gonna kill you.
I love that.
And disappear. I would. I just like it's enough. It's enough.
So Kara would
There was someone I
murder
was
him.
writing. There was someone I was writing about in tech, and they were like, "When are you gonna stop?" And I said, "When you stay down."
Good for you.
Yeah, but they didn't stay down. They all stay rich, I can tell you that. Okay, how do you produce on such a high level? I want to know that too, besides being a young man. What are your keys to success in this arena? What is your terrier-like mentality, obviously?
Right, I'm very stubborn. I think any source who has been hounded by me will tell you I can be extremely annoying.
I've heard that.
and persistent. I also hope that I bring a certain level of compassion to these conversations. I certainly aspire to. You know, there were women who ultimately decided not to put their name on their stories. And that, of course, is always disappointing as a reporter, but I always respected those wishes, and not every outlet that reported on this did that. You know, there were people who used names without permission, and you know, I'm not demonizing that. Every reporter makes different calls, but I just felt, having seen my sister live through this and knowing what a personal experience it was important to make sure that they had the opportunity to consent in every way and really control their destinies. And I think giving sources that latitude is probably part
What
of.
about your own energy levels? I mean, you're
I don't sleep a lot.
okay.
I really need to. I would probably be a lot more likable if I slept ever. I don't manage my time well at all. I mean, this last period was crazy.
Seems like you work a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was really like working on the Weinstein stories until 2 a.m. at One World Trade in New York, and then going home and like typing until my fingers were bleeding, and turning in a draft of War on Peace at like 10 a.m., and then collapsing for 3 hours, and then going back to work. So I was just, you know, I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping, I was, you know, my poor partner, who you know, was like
Yeah.
taking calls from me, and I'm, you know, falling apart constantly. Like, they're coming after me, and they're trying to kill me, and I'm, you know, I have no job. And he's like, yeah, I got a life too. I can't
Yeah.
do this all the time.
Yeah. John, his partners don't love it. Pain in the ass, but I love it.
You know, and I was really lucky to also have a great support system in that respect. My mom is wonderful.
Yeah.
And really instilled a really strong sense of public service. Thank you,
I
guys.
saw her at the.
She deserves that applause. And I would extend that to any strong single mom out there. I just learned so much watching her, and, you know, admire her so much.
I saw you at the Time 100. She looked thrilled.
Yeah,
it was a cute picture.
she's the sweetest. Yeah,
Yeah.
she's a fan of yours.
Yeah. She's a pretty good movie star.
She is a pretty good movie star.
Yeah, I just saw it. Rosemary's Baby the other day. It was on TV.
She's wonderful in it.
She was good in that one. That was a good one. Yeah. She was good in a lot of stuff. Would you define the U.S. as a dying empire? What can we do to preserve the republic, or is it too late? Oh well.
Oh, that's cheerful.
Yeah.
I do not
We did
think
have that civil war, and we managed to recover from it. So perhaps
we've recovered from a lot.
Yes, we have. We have a terrible history.
I do not think that War on Peace is a eulogy. I view it as actually quite optimistic in the end. I wouldn't have bothered writing the thing if I didn't think there was a way out. And the last section of the book is actually devoted to profiling how you can turn things around. And it uses some of those examples from the Obama administration where the first part of the book, kind of lays waste to the Obama administration and the ways in which it screwed this up, and the ways in which that is sort of a microcosm for the more extreme ills happening now. But the end is really about looking at the turnaround and the lessons we can derive from that. And I think that there is a roadmap to pulling out of the nosedive. And I think that, as I said, as much as there are fears about Mike Pompeo coming in, there's also a lot of hope. And there's a lot resting on his shoulders and the shoulders of the next administration that comes in.
Then, okay, all right. This is interesting. Who will or should succeed Mike Pompeo? He just got there, right?
I want to assume that that's some like pretty high level humor.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's
there
no one
for
is
a
safe
while.
for more than 5 minutes in
Right.
this administration.
Right.
Who should succeed Mike Pompeo?
Not Scott Pruitt, obviously, but
Not Scott Pruitt. I mean, I would say
come on.
there were two.
Sorry. Guys,
Some Scott Pruitt fans here.
I guess.
I talk about how the White House was leaking these rumors about Tillerson's firing, and there were always two names that were leaked as potential successors, one of which was Pompeo and the other of which was Nikki Haley.
Nikki Haley, right?
So if Mike Pompeo gets fired
It's Nikki Haley.
in the next 5 minutes, I don't know if it's Nikki Haley or she would
Right.
want to do that. She says she wouldn't, but
Oh, come
something to think about.
people. So they, she was.
This is
gotten
why
a-
we need Kara Swisher to run for office, by the way.
These people.
Bring honesty,
No,
bring
thank you.
Swisher back.
Thank you. Thank
to
you,
politics.
campaign manager. We have some very great mayoral candidates in San Francisco coming. But
She's
Nikki
thinking about
Haley.
it. You can tell she's
Nikki,
thinking about it.
I'm thinking now about a bigger office. Nikki Haley, she had a back and forth over the Russia things. What is her status now?
She has a lot of back and forth with this administration now,
Right.
and without betraying any confidences, I will tell you, most reporters who have dealt with her team would tell you that one of the first things that they stress is her independence from this administration.
Right.
And I think that she has a political future ahead of her in a
Yeah.
way not all of these administration officials do, and she is being pretty savvy about trying to preserve that.
Yeah, it's interesting. She literally has "I will be running for president soon" all over her. It seems like.
Yeah, I mean, look,
Feels like it.
this is an administration that has so stripped back our expertise and our culture of expertise that
Mm-hmm.
anyone who's just not insane
Right. Yeah.
feels like an oasis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'd agree with you.
Yeah.
All right, last question. We have 2 more minutes, and I have one last question. If Susan Rice had been confirmed as Secretary of State instead of John Kerry, how would the American diplomacy have differed in Obama's second term?
They're both on the record in this book. They're both people who kind of hew, I think, close to a certain establishment model of leadership and values in the Democratic Party, and I don't know that it would have been that different. I mean, John Kerry was probably uniquely ambitious in terms of wanting that job and wanting that
Yeah.
legacy in that job, and he's going
Right.
to take a break from windsurfing if he has to.
Right, right.
And I mean, I joke about that, but honestly, he was. I usually don't give these kinds of blunt assessments of leadership, good or bad, in this job. I think there's a really good argument that he was a spectacular Secretary of State.
He had to be.
And I've seen him be, a blowhard and all these things. He gave really thoughtful, insightful answers to tough questions in this, and I string him up for, not being hard enough on various human rights things. There's all sorts of tough things about John Kerry in this book. I don't know the guy that well. I saw him in action when he was, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I was working on AFPAC stuff, and he was already trying
Who's
to
the
cultivate.
key senator in all this? It was John McCain. Who was
It depends on in what respect you mean. I mean, Kerry was a key senator
Right now.
in a lot of the conflicts that I profile when he was in that role. He
Is there a senator right now?
I talk about Patrick Leahy a lot as someone who tried to introduce a layer of accountability to those military-to-military relationships. The Leahy Law is the one thing that
Anyone
prevents
right
us
now in the
from
Republican? It was Corker, I guess.
I mean, Lindsey Graham has done some shuttle diplomacy in a pretty high-profile way. He shows up in a couple of the anecdotes here.
And last question for me: Who's your favorite Secretary of State? Not Tia Leone, please. Of all the ones you interviewed.
That was going to be my next joke.
Yeah, no, can't do that.
I was profoundly moved by Colin Powell's contribution to this book. And I know people, not incorrectly criticize him and call him to task for his involvement in Iraq. But what he evinces in terms of sincere commitment to the workforce of American diplomacy and his raw emotional devastation at what he describes as an administration tearing the guts out of diplomacy, mortgaging your future, he says, was a level of candor that he didn't need to go to.
Right.
And reflects a really sincere kind of leadership that I wish we had more of. And, you talk to a guy like Colin Powell in the midst of all of the tawdry and awful stories about present-day politics, and you see a kind of decorum from
Classy guy.
a very different era. Yeah, and it really breaks my heart.
Yeah. What are you working on next? Jesus Christ, I can't wait.
She says,
What are
looking
you
at me
working
with
on? What
the
are you
eyes of a
No,
hawk.
seriously, enough of this. You did this, okay. Harvey Weinstein, War and Diplomacy. What's next?
I am hard at work at my next New Yorker story.
Okay.
I am starting my HBO deal,
Which is a
and
new show,
I had to make the complicated decision whether to go back to the morning TV, reading spaghetti recipes with Matt Lauer in the
Please
plaza type thing.
No,
that I was doing.
Matt Lauer's gone. Since
I
you
would
were
not
at
have been going. I
NBC?
would not have been going back to him, but
No.
the equivalent.
He
somewhere else.
gone.
And I decided in the end that as much as I, like anyone else, is vulnerable to the shiny thing of a lot of airtime, one of the lessons of this series of stories is if you go really deep and work your ass off for a long time to get it right, people respond to that and it resonates in a really special way. So the HBO deal is kind of a cool one-off
It's a
in
new
that.
show. It's a
Yeah, I mean, honestly, they are letting me shape it to whatever degree of frequency I want. I think that trying to heed that lesson, I will likely do less frequent, very, very in-depth, documentary miniseries around hopefully the biggest stories in America. And that will be, shared with the reporting that I'm already doing in print and along the same lines about abuses of power and cover-ups. And I was heartbroken that I didn't get the chance to tell those stories visually. If you look at the progression of the investigations I was doing on television, you can see the direction that was going in, and
Right.
I'm excited that I have the chance to tackle that.
Well, you're a pretty decent reporter from what I can understand here.
So are you, Kara.
Yeah,
So I
think
appreciate
you're-
hearing that.
You've surpassed me already. But thank you
Not
so
in terms of sass.
Sass, no. But, just like Russ Turleson, I could give a fuck. So, anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you.
Thank you.